Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. As said, I'm Guy Goldstein. I'm the author of the political fiction that deals with cyber conflict, Babel Minute Zero, in the Hebrew version, Babel Shat Efes, with Shock Publishing House. So what can a fiction tell us? Thanks, Yvonne. What can a fiction tell us beyond metaphors about cyber warfare? Well, it's a very good question, and I'm going to show you there are important connections here. I will start first by showing how fictions have helped to think about the future, and discuss some of the hypotheses in Babel Minute Zero and how they relate actually to cyber warfare. As Mark Twain said, prediction is difficult, especially of the future. That's also the case for the use of new weapons. Back in the mid-1950s, a brilliant researcher from Harvard, Dr. Kissinger, described an innovative way to wage limited nuclear warfare with the use of small, self-contained units which would bypass cities. Problem, when tested during NATO exercises, limited nuclear warfare would actually lead to more than 5 million West German casualties, 5 times the level during World War II. And this is one among many other examples of the difficulties to predict the use of the new weapons. Starting, for example, with the early age of air power. Its first advocate, Italian General Giulio II in 1921, thought then that the main use of air bombardment would be to destroy civilian morale. This was unfortunately proven wrong, both in Germany and in Britain during World War II. But we shouldn't be too surprised about this and not too hard on Dr. Kissinger and General Douhet. Percy Corbett, former chairman of the Department of Political Science at Yale University, mentioned once, if you don't have the data, and you will not have them for future warfare, any models are just but personal intuition. And then, if we deal about personal intuition, it can be interesting at times to look at fiction writers, people who do deal with personal intuition all the time, and sometimes they have been proven interestingly prescient. For example, H.G. Wells, in The World Set Free, written in 1914, anticipated the use by world powers of the atom bomb, an expression he was the first to create. Closer to us, William Gibson gave birth to a cyberspace populated by hackers in his book Neuromancer, written 6 years before the creation of the World Wide Web. The interesting thing here is that both modern political thrillers and science fiction stories often deal with two types of disruption happening in the same time, a political disruption and a technological one. And in the mid-1990s, when I started writing Babel, the two emerging disruptions were the rise of China and the slow emergence of a new type of warfare described in a 1993 paper by the RAND Corporation titled Cyber War is Coming. And so, in Babel Shat Efes, Babel Minute Zero, I try to imagine what happens when China uses cyber weapons. But to think through this, it is necessary to understand how much technology defines warfare and can make or break world peace. For example, if we had this talk 50 years ago, we would have seen how nuclear technology and the threat of mutually assured destruction would have forced the two superpowers to avoid direct military confrontation. However, if we had this talk 70 years ago, we would have seen how the rise of airplanes and mechanized forces supports the Blitzkrieg doctrine, which gives an advantage to the offense and makes war possible again in Europe. So technology can make or break world peace. And to understand what can be the impact of a new technology of cyber weapon, here's a few hypotheses from Babel Minute Zero on their characteristic of cyber weapons. First, they can be used for strategic deception. Second, they need the capabilities of advanced states for their development. Third, they can have far-reaching effects but do not come at this stage with clear military thresholds. Fourth, they bear all the characteristics of first-strike weapons. And fifth, if they become ubiquitous without some international understanding, they could destabilize the international system. So first, imagine that your country is cyber-attacked and plunged into darkness. Well, you may not know who's behind the attacks. Cyber weapons have these characteristics that they can be used without leaving a clear trace. any aggressor can claim plausible deniability. This gives an advantage to the offense. First, the defender doesn't know who to retaliate against, and any additional time to respond may weaken further the defender. Second, plausible deniability will make it harder for the defender to build a robust coalition. And third, if the defender retaliates against the wrong country, it may create another enemy and be further weakened internationally and militarily. There are today numerous examples of this issue. For example, back in 2007 in Estonia, where pro-Russian cyber militias attacked Estonia internet network, and NATO never openly threatened Russia because NATO had no certain evidence that the Kremlin was behind the attack. Another example is the hacktivist group Anonymous. It is not a military threat at this stage, but an excellent example that even civilian protest movements have fully internalized this key characteristic of cyber warfare, starting with their own name, Anonymous. To complicate matters, since 1986 and the brain virus from Pakistan, all of the major virus or worm infections have been global. For example, here on this slide with Conficker in 2008. So every country gets infected, including your list of usual suspects, but also countries which have nothing to do with your quarrel. And that's a perfect way to create confusion and mask attribution, even in times of overall diplomatic or military tension. But deception can take also several forms. In 2010, a Japanese virus, Zéro, was able to capture embarrassing screenshots of its victims, list their web history, and then ask about $10 reward for destruction of information. So now, imagine if a malware would target individuals from, say, reserve to active forces or even politicians, and take control of their web history and their online bank accounts, and then request the victim to do certain actions. If there is no clear attribution, the embarrassed victim may not imagine it is a national security issue, and then cooperate and not report to authorities, thinking it is a minor criminal operation. And if all of this is coordinated and there are many victims, the impact could be significant. But deception can also directly be used between countries. For example, a country A may ask for the help of country B against a group of cyber terrorists. But country A may ignore that country B is actually behind of the cyber terrorist. And then country B, in exchange of its benevolent help, will reap political gains from this attack. Or, another scenario, country B could activate hacker militias inside of country A. Those cyber militias would then attack other countries, isolating dangerously country A. In all these examples, states are the main players and terrorists just tools. And there are a couple of technological reasons for this. Imagine I have a 10-year-old explosive based on a 70-year-old formula, for example, RDX. Well, I can still wreak havoc, like the Mumbai train bombing of 2006 that killed 200 people and used RDX. Now, imagine I have instead a 10-year-old cyber weapon. Well, I will be pretty useless. And if it's a cyber weapon already used once, I may be totally useless. Terrorism uses relatively low-tech, old-formula weapons, but the technology of cyber weapons need constant efforts. So why so? First, because the hardware and the software environment is continuously upgrading, so you need to constantly update your cyber weapons. Second, because the operating mode of cyber weapons is to smartly identify a flaw in a very advanced IT equipment, and for that, you need top talent. Third, because top talent is scarce and is naturally attracted by a very efficiently financed IT industry, so it's impossible to go on the cheap. And fourth, if you really want to find the flaws, top talent is not enough. You may need intelligence, which means privileged access to the IT ecosystem, global software or hardware providers or top engineering schools and labs. This all means that true fighting capability is limited to the top richest and most developed OECD countries. Not something cooked up by a couple of guys in a cave in Waziristan. But if pirates need states to get real cyber weapons, states may also need pirates, especially when states want to launch attacks against civilians, something in contradiction with the law of armed conflicts. Nothing new here. Over the last 100 years or so, most terror organizations have at times crossed the path of states or even been fully supported by them. And attacks against civilian assets are actually possible because of a very wide range of potential effects with cyber weapons. This is an obvious and direct consequence of the accelerating pervasive use of automatized computation and communication in both civilian and military processes. Communication, finance, or energy networks could be victims of attacks. They could collapse and significantly weaken target states. Government communications could be in danger, risking state paralysis. So these operational level weapons could have a strategic effect, and that may be one of the reasons in the US they are partly under the purview of the US Strategic Command. But to the difference of strategic nuclear forces, which leave no doubts to their deadly effects, with cyber weapons, there is no clarity on effects, nor taboo in use so far. We hint at equivalence of effects with military action, but there are no clear studies that would describe simple, recognizable, conspicuous threshold, what Thomas Schinning has mentioned as one of the key elements for the idiom of war. For example, after how many hours or weeks of a blackout there is significant loss of life, significant deterioration of police forces, and non-recoverable collapse of industrial output. And should any of that elicit diplomatic actions, or economic sanctions, or limited kinetic actions, or large strike actions, or strategic strikes? Cyber weapons do not necessarily kill nor destroy, but they can degrade and instill doubts in capacities. In that context, the articulations between cyber impacts, level of national degradations, and required levels of retaliation are still very, very fuzzy at this stage. Additionally, because it is a new technology, some new powers may have forgotten old taboos about warfare. For example, Chinese officers in a book published in 1999 called Unrestricted Warfare mentioned the possibility to launch asymmetric attack against civilian targets. But if civilians are deliberately selected as targets in conflicts, then it is against the law of armed conflicts. And if on top of that, the attacks against civilians are masked without clear attribution and designed to scare civilian population, then it is actually awfully close to an act of terrorism as defined by the United Nations High-Level Panel on Threats. So not only these weapons can have far-reaching impacts, but they also demonstrate particular behaviors, some resembling special operation forces. First, they can hit without any early warning at what is called the zero day. Their impact can be close to immediate. Second, attack codes are highly specialized, tailored to the objective. The best example of that is a Stuxnet swarm, an excellent example of a weaponized code. Third, before attack codes are launched and manifest themselves, it is close to impossible to identify or monitor them. You cannot launch satellites or spy planes to detect them from miles away. Impossible. And it is indeed hard to monitor and understand the capabilities of the adversary. For example, imagine that a potential enemy declares it's creating new cyber war capabilities, but only for defensive use. Great. But from the outside, how can you make sure it's not also for offensive use? There is no functionally related observable differences between capabilities, to use an expression in SALT II agreements. To sum up, these weapons lack attribution, have strategic effects, strike without warning, are extremely precise, and cannot be monitored beforehand. These are characteristics of what Thomas Schinning has called first strike weapons. These are weapons superbly tailored for the offense in general, and for surprise attack in particular. And if in the 21st century they end up dominating weapon systems because control of cyberspace as a combat domain becomes critical, then the overall technical military environment will give the advantage to the offense. And all that is fine if those weapons remain between friendly hands, but without proper doctrine, if it becomes a problem if those weapons start being developed across the globe wide. Well, if we sum up what we've seen of cyber weapons, first, you don't know clearly if they're used for defense or offense, or both. You cannot monitor enemy's capabilities. And second, you do know that they are first strike weapons and give a clear advantage to the offense. In a seminal paper from 1978, Columbia University professor Robert Jervis developed a model to understand what military environment could trigger or not a war. And in an environment where you don't know if the enemy is preparing for the attack of a defense, and when you know that the military technology gives an advantage to the offense, you end up in this doubly dangerous environment, the most conducive to war. And this is the environment being shaped up today slowly by the emerging use of cyber weapons. And by the way, it is the environment of Europe at the onset of World War I. But things get even more complicated today with the current geopolitical situation. Remember the Cold War? It was a tough and dangerous game, but it was a two-player game, so coordination was possible. But today, in our multipolar world, coordination is becoming difficult. And cyber weapons may reduce further trust because no one knows who's going to cyber attack. This is an integral system that could lead to what Thomas Schelling has called the reciprocal fear of surprise attack. Since I cannot trust anyone, I can't trust my neighbor, I might take matters in my own hands and be the first to preemptively attack a potential enemy. Indeed, last year, in a New York Times article, it was revealed that some at NSA were actually thinking of preemptive attacks in case of an imminent cyber threat against the US. And in this unstable environment, who knows how a country on the brink may respond? Cyber weapons, they do not replace the conventional and strategic weapon arsenal, but, as we've seen, they add an additional factor of instability. And an instability compounded by one of the operating mode of cyber weapons by creating information errors. Now, what happens if because of unintended consequences after a cyber operation, or because of a purely technical glitch, or both, the wrong assets are degraded at the wrong time, and this is gravely misinterpreted? There are dozens of significant blackouts in the US every year. Hopefully, they will not happen during high tension with China. So what to do to avoid making a mistake while defending national interest? Well, here's a few thoughts on how to defend against critical cyber attacks. But to sum up, they rely on one idea expressed in the book. You can attack alone, but you may need your friends to organize a robust defense, especially since building this coalition of friends is what you may want most. So first, ideas. Focus on intelligence to identify the most critical thing. Who actually is behind the attack? And this means cyber forensics, but also signal intelligence or human intelligence. This will give the biggest bang for your bucks, because once you can make attribution, then you can leverage all your military and diplomatic options. On the other hand, without attribution, you cannot deploy all the strengths of yours, and you actually remain the blind victim of the manipulation. More fundamentally, no deterrence doctrine will ever be credible if the most basic capability, the capability to identify your aggressor, cannot be demonstrated. Second, the manner to prosecute and communicate on your intelligence efforts may help to identify the attacker. The defending state can create what Thomas Schelling has called compellence, a process comparable to coercive interrogation where the defending state will pressure suspected states to cooperate. If one of the suspected states does not cooperate in good faith, then this confirms it's the aggressor. By the way, during the Estonia episode and afterwards, Russia never wanted to fully cooperate to understand what had happened. So meanwhile, strong pressure is exerted, by example, by deciding on a ban of all IT products and services as long as certain level of cooperation have not been established, something MI5 subtly threatened to do already with regards to Chinese products back 3 years ago. This type of strategies, close to a police investigation or medical pandemics investigation, have actually been hinted at somehow by William Lin, the current Deputy Secretary of Defense. Is this a state of war? Not yet, though it could lead to one with proper process. Additionally, the process does not require to accuse namely the attacker. Lack of public attribution can actually be useful. The blame can lay on pirates so that the aggressor cooperate without losing face. Third, the very importance to share intelligence with close allies, like with Base Alliance, the counter-terrorist center set up after 9/11 in France and supported by the US, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, France, and Germany. But beyond accessing up-to-date information, the real deal here is that getting together will help enforce the compliance process we've just talked. 100% attribution is never going to happen. So what matters is to convince your allies of a sufficiently high probability of attribution and then create an alliance block to prosecute and credibly enforce the coercive investigation. Because once you have convinced your friend and once the rest of the world listens to you and your friends, then you can significantly increase the range of options to use to retaliate. And fourth and final, the threshold mentioned previously must be identified. A clear linkage must be established between cyber action, national means of power, and the public goods provided by the state, starting with security. This should be done in part as an international effort among friends so that thresholds of pain endured by the state and then the necessary escalation is accepted by friends and rightly interpreted by the enemy. But also, as importantly, to establish ceasefire and de-escalate. As we've seen, you cannot really monitor enemy capabilities from far away. However, you can de-escalate by graded reciprocal moves. But for moves to be meaningful and significant, you need a common understanding of what are the thresholds. Finally, why should we care about cyber threats? For two reasons. First, as hinted at the Prime Minister, the underlying technology of a computer calculation and communication is undergoing a revolutionary process. Since the first computer in the late 1930s, calculation power of the top computers of the day has been multiplied by a factor between 50 and 350 every 10 years, and this is accelerating. Anecdotally, today, the top supercomputers may be close somehow to the theoretical calculation of a human, theoretical calculation power of a human brain, perhaps 10 to the power of 15 floating operations per second, perhaps above. This means, anyway, that computers will continue to do more things, and that cyberspace will be even more important for our societies. Or to put it differently, that the security of cyberspace in the 21st century will be as critical, if not more, than was, for example, secure access to oil in the 20th century. Second and final reason, today, especially with the example of Stuxnet, we may have a proof of concept, but the type of cyber threats we've just talked about is already technically possible. In that context, without international security framework for cyberspace, this breathtaking pace of technological improvements could naturally trigger an across-the-board arms race and perhaps one of the escalation envisioned by shelling. So in this fast-changing context, it is actually very heartening to hear lately that in the US, in Israel, in other key countries, significant efforts are being made to develop new doctrine for cyber weapons, and that in some instances, international forms of cooperation are being stressed, either closer integrations with allies or international agreements to build common norms. But let's be certain that we're just but at the start of it. Many blanks will need to be filled. Besides, the non-stop evolution of information technology will make cyber weapons the structuring features of international relations. General Jules Douai started to write about air power around the first air bombardment in history in 1911. For cyber weapons, this is now 1911. The story of a new century needs to be written. Let us hope that as we embark in a new technology revolution, we avoid the fatal errors of the 20th century and maintain peace and stability in cyberspace, but most of all, in the physical world. Thank you.